Okay, this is the third video in this series from this Meiosis Lab, and what we need to go over here is some terms related to genetics. So, first term that we need is the term gene. Now, directly what a gene does is a gene tells the cell how to make a protein. The thing is, unless you're a biochemist, you're probably not going to be looking directly at the proteins. What we're going to look at is the end result of those proteins. What happens due to the presence or absence of those proteins. And so what we see is things like the hair color, the hair texture, the eye color, the amount of pigmentation in the skin, things like that. So another way of looking at a gene is it's a segment of DNA controlling the expression of a trait. Now, under the heading of gene, we have the term alleles. And alleles are the different forms of a gene. So, for example, we have a gene or a strand of DNA that controls hair color. Well, that strand of DNA could have slightly different codes. One version of that strand of DNA for hair color could produce dark hair. Another version of that same gene could produce red hair. So the alleles are the different forms of the gene. You notice the next example down there. We could have a gene controlling hair texture. You could have alleles for straight hair or alleles for curly hair. Now, there's a number of different systems that are used to identify these alleles. Some alleles will have standardized symbols. Here we're just going to use the simplest version of identifying these alleles, and that simplest version is to use the same letter of the alphabet for the different alleles of a gene. And then for one allele we'll use the uppercase letter such as big R. For the other allele we'll use the lowercase letter such as little r. Okay. And now another term that we need to look at is genotype. So the genotype is literally what the word says, the type of genes. And so a genotype refers to a pair of alleles making up a gene, and it's represented by that pair of letters that we just looked at. So a person could have on the two homologous chromosomes, person could have the allele for dark hair on both of those, which would be represented as big R and big R. Person could have the allele for dark hair on one chromosome and the allele for red hair on the other chromosome, which would be represented as big R and little r. Or the person could have the allele for red hair on both of the homologous chromosomes, so represented as little r, little r. So the genotype always refers to a diploid cell. That is, we're going to have pairs of homologous chromosomes in the same cell, so we're going to have two alleles for this same gene in that cell. Okay, so we've got another term now, phenotype. So genotype is literally what it says, the type of genes. Now think of phenotype as physical. This is what we see. This is the appearance of the characteristic. And instead of a symbolism such as big R, this is going to be a description, like red hair, dark hair, straight, curly hair, straight hair, curly hair, such as that. So tall, short, whatever. It's going to be some kind of description. It's going to be the physical characteristic that we can see. Now we've got the mechanism by which these alleles interact with each other. And one mechanism is dominance. At the end of this, we're going to have a different mechanism called incomplete dominance. And you need to be familiar with the pattern that would be seen in the due to dominance versus the pattern that would be seen due to incomplete dominance. And so with dominance, one allele can completely hide the expression of the other allele. So you notice in the examples given here on this screen, you have the possible genotypes, big R, big R, big R, little r, little r, little r. Okay? Then you have the phenotypes. Well, that one at the top, if a person has two alleles, both of which code for dark hair, there's not too many other options. The person's going to have dark hair. In that one at the bottom, if a person has two alleles, both coding for red hair, not a whole lot of options. The person's going to have red hair. But where dominance comes into play is this one in the middle, where the person is big R, little r. In that case, notice what's going to happen is the little r is going to be completely hidden. So with the effects of that, we're just going to see if I can kind of mark that out right there. So we are going to only see the effects of this one allele. The other allele recedes, or is said to be recessive. So basically that would be dominance. One allele completely hides the effect of the other allele. Okay, so, and hang on, it's not letting me advance. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we've got a few terms that go with this idea of dominance. We've got the term dominant allele, and the dominant allele, that is the allele that's expressed in that mixed pair. So the allele big R is dominant over the allele little r, because in that genotype big R, little r, only big R for dark hair is expressed. Then we've got the term dominant trait. Trait means phenotype. And so dominant trait is the trait or the phenotype that is expressed in the in this big R, little r. So in what's called the heterozygote. Okay. Then we've got the term recessive allele. That is the allele that is hidden in that mixed pair. And we've got the recessive trait. That is the trait or the phenotype that is due to the recessive allele. The only way that a person can have a recessive trait is, whoops, go back here, is that the person has to be right here, homozygous recessive. Okay? So both alleles have to code for that recessive trait, because if one of these alleles was the dominant allele, that's what would be expressed. Okay, we've also got this term homologous. Homologous refers to the chromosomes. This is two chromosomes that are the same size, same structure, and they carry genes controlling the same characteristics. So homologous chromosomes are sometimes called a homologous pair of chromosomes. Within a homologous pair of chromosomes, one of those chromosomes is a copy of the chromosome that came from dad. The other is a copy of the chromosome that came from mom. Okay? Now we've got the terms heterozygous and homozygous. So let's go back just a second. Notice the term homologous refers to chromosomes. Homozygous and heterozygous refer to the genes on the chromosome, or the alleles on the chromosome. So hetero means different. So a heterozygous genotype, or what's called a heterozygote, the two alleles in the gene pair are different from each other. Big R, little r. Okay? In a homozygous genotype, the word homo means same. So we talk about a homozygous genotype or a homozygote. Both of the alleles are the same within that gene pair. So big R would be homozygous. Little r would be homozygous. Now obviously these two, big R is different from little r, so we need another descriptor. So we can talk about a genotype being homozygous dominant. Both of the alleles are in the dominant form, or we can talk about the genotype being homozygous recessive. Both of the alleles are in the recessive form. Okay? Now we need to look at the gametes. The term gamete is just kind of a general term for the reproductive cells or the sex cells. these are the egg cells and the sperm cells. These cells are always going to be haploid. You're going to have one chromosome from each homologous pair, and so it's going to be represented as one allele or one letter from each pair. So notice right here, if an individual has the genotype big R, then those are on two homologous chromosomes. Those chromosomes will separate from each other. Each one of the egg cells or each one of the sperm cells will carry one copy of that, one copy of big R. Okay, if a person is heterozygous with big R, little r, then when this person produces egg cells or sperm cells, these two homologous chromosomes separate from each other, and half of the egg cells carry big R, half of the egg cells carry little r. Same thing with sperm cells. Half the sperm cells carry big R, half the... Okay, so that's the idea of a genotype and then the resulting gametes. So let's look at this other concept right here. We had the idea of dominance. Dominance is where one allele completely hides the effects of the other allele. The other mechanism that can be seen in inheritance is incomplete dominance. In incomplete dominance, the heterozygote is going to be intermediate between the two parents. Remember, in dominance, the heterozygote would look just like one of the two homozygotes. So let's look at this with an example. It'll make more sense. So you notice here's our example with these plants that are called 4 o'clocks. They produce different colored flowers. You have all the same color flower on one plant. So we could have this plant that produces red flowers. That would be the phenotype. We could cross that with this plant that produces white flowers. Again, that's a phenotype. Now, this plant that has red flowers is going to be homozygous for red. We'll just call that big R, big R. Plant that produces white flowers is going to be homozygous for white, and we'll call that little r, little r. And then when these plants produce egg cells or sperm cells, the two homologous chromosomes will separate, and we'll get one of those homologous chromosomes in each egg cell and one of these homologous chromosomes in each sperm cell. So all the egg cells here will carry the allele for red. All the sperm cells here will carry the alleles for white. And yes, we use the same terms, egg and sperm cells, for plants as we do in animals. And so when these unite, we get the offspring, and the genotype is going to be heterozygous, big R, little r. One allele for red, one allele for white. And this time, rather than one allele hiding the effects of the other, we get both alleles being expressed, but we get a blending effect. And so the plant has pink flowers. Okay, so that is incomplete dominance. Now to contrast that with dominance, if these plants had dominance, which they do not, they have incomplete dominance, but if they had dominance, we'd have red flowers crossed with white flowers. Both of these are homozygous. The red flowered plants would pass on the allele only for red. The white flowered plants would only pass on the allele for white. The offspring would be heterozygous, but this time with dominance, we would not see both alleles being expressed, and we would not see a blending effect, but we would see only one of the alleles being expressed. One allele would be expressed, the other would recede. And so here the offspring would have red flowers just like this one parent. Now normally we'll let the uppercase letter represent the dominant allele, but just for the sake of argument, let's say white flowers was the dominant and dominant phenotype, and little r was the dominant allele. And then in our heterozygote, if that's the case, the dominant allele, which in the case of this one, we're saying little r is the dominant. The little r for white flowers would be expressed, and this offspring would have white flowers just like this parent. Okay, so you'll have some questions on the quiz asking you to distinguish between dominance and incomplete dominance. I'll give you examples and ask you to identify whether the mechanism at hand is dominant or incomplete. Thank you.